faces coming in. All right, well, I will start because people are tuning in from all over the world. Some people have got up very early to attend. Some people are staying up quite late. I really appreciate everybody coming today. So I'd like to welcome you to the session, which is our virtual book launch of our Human-Animal Relationships in Times of Pandemic and Climate Crisis. Chantel, did you press the record button for us? Great. So first of all, I'd just like to do an acknowledgement of country. I'd like to acknowledge the ancestors and descendants of the Yugambeh people of the Bundjalung Nation, which is where I'm located now, where my writing, my thinking, my teaching takes place. And I want to acknowledge this is unceded Aboriginal land, always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and pay my respects to elders past and present. If people would like to share the country that they're joining us from in the chat, you are very welcome to do so. So thank you again, everybody, for tuning in. It's really wonderful to see so many people registering and attending this evening or this morning for the people getting up in Europe and America. So we are just going to have a pretty relaxed chat about the book to launch it. Here's an outline of what we're going to be doing. First of all, we're going to give a little bit of a background to the book, and then Zoe's going to speak to our introduction. What is multi-species sociology and why is it necessary? And then we're going to have many of the contributors are here this evening, and they're going to speak to their chapters just in a few words. And then we will have a Q&A. So if people could mute their microphones, I think most people have. Thank you very much. And if you could put any questions you have in the chat as we go through, and then we'll attend to that at the end when we've had a listen to what the contributors have to say about their chapters. So I have many thanks to give that I did have to write them down because I didn't want to forget anybody, and I really hope I haven't. First of all, thank you very much to the Australasian Animal Studies Association for hosting and supporting this event. Many of the contributors in the Oceania region now are currently serving in leadership roles in ASA. I also want to thank the Griffith Centre for Social and Cultural Research, which provided some funding for this book, and that's where I was working when I began the book. Also our editor, Sue Jarvis, and the editors at Routledge, to the Australian Sociological Association for support of our Sociology and Animals group. They've always been amazing. To the International Association of Vegan Sociologists, whose conferences and contributors to this volume have also been pivotal to making it all happen. To Pam Priest and Heidi Townsend for some of the photographs you're going to see this evening, and to my children for all their help and support. Most especially, I want to thank Zoe for being my co-editor on this collection, and also all of the amazing contributors. Every time I received a chapter and read it, I felt so humbled and grateful for their work in bringing this together and bringing this to fruition and to publication. So thank you so much to everybody. The other thing I want to do is, most importantly, acknowledge all the animal others that we live with, that we engage with, that we do research on, especially animals whose plights are really on the margins. We're conscious of their lives as we work to challenge human-animal relations, and all these animals are really why this group of people are here today launching this research. So I will just move on to the next slide. This gives you an outline of the contents of the book, which is divided into 3 sections. And I'd just like to say that before I move to Zoe introducing it through what we put into our introduction, I met Zoe at the Australasian Animal Studies Association conference in 2019, and then worked with her at the Australian Sociological Association, where we moved to a new normal conference when COVID hit. And that became online. And as a result of that panel, which also included Dinesh and Gavin Smith, Routledge approached us about publishing this research. So that was the foundation of this research. In analysing the social world, sociology has always had a central strength, which is a critique of what is normative or making the familiar strange. Sociologists gather data to demonstrate and explore inequities, and consequently, they think really carefully about responding to injustice and proposing futures that materially improve lives. To date, however, sociology has been slow to embrace the animal turn. In the face of the links between our often normalised mistreatment of other animals and pandemics and climate crises, this needs addressing. The old normal that led to the wicked problems that humans are facing today cannot continue. Ironically, this evening, I wasn't sure if I would have a very good link because of climate-induced storms that we're currently suffering again in southeastern Queensland. So, plus, of course, things that have happened only this week, such as what's happening at the moment in Spain, which is appalling. So in this collection, we aim to demonstrate many of the ways in which animal lives are deeply embedded in our everyday social worlds, exploring ways that the structures, practices, and institutions we so often now take for granted as normal are human-centric. They're inherently hierarchical and frequently violent, and these problematic human-animal relationships are deeply implicated in both pandemics and the climate crisis. We know that pandemics are set to increase and intensify as are extreme weather events. So in this book, we are arguing that unless we consider the many and varied ways in which our problematic relationships with animals are implicated in pandemics and climate crises, we can only ever have a partial response and opportunities for thinking about futures that increase justice and survival for all. So Zoe, if you would like to speak to why multi-species sociology and our introduction.
All right. That's kind of a 2-for-1. Thank you very much, Josephine, and thank you everyone for being here. Okay, so I feel like Josephine's kind of summed up the crux of the book, which is really what our introduction is about as well. But when we were writing this book, we were coming off the back of Black Summer bushfires, which we're all familiar with, and some very intense flooding around Australia. And through the pandemic, when we were all kind of sent home on lockdowns, I think we saw that for perhaps the first time, Western humans were very limited in their mobility. They were kind of constricted to their homes. And what happened that we saw is that non-human animals started reclaiming space in different ways. They had a little bit more ability to move around the social world when it wasn't taken up with humans all of the time and capitalist activity and all of the things that we know very much encroach on non-human lives. And it gave us an opportunity to observe different ways of relating with other species, firstly through seeing kind of multi-species flourishing when humans were removed from shared spaces. And also when we were confined to our home spaces, it kind of gave us an opportunity to actually engage with the multi-species lives that we were already living, with the animals who lived in our home, with the kinds of relationships that we had. And even though it was a very awful and a very traumatic and an event that had kind of far-ranging effects that we're still feeling, there was kind of that opportunity when we were talking about the new normal to start thinking about what we might want the new normal to look like. We know human relations with other animals are not good. We know they're exploitative. We know that they're very, very harmful. And we had this point in time where if we wanted to, which we now know we didn't take up, we could kind of start rethinking these things. We had a bit of space, we had a bit of time, we had opportunities of observation, where if we wanted to learn to live less badly with other animals, we had a few kind of touch points where we could start doing that reimagining. And I guess for us, that felt a little bit like an opportunity for humans in the world, but also for multi-species sociology. So sociology historically was not a discipline that really considered animals, even though we had calls in the 1940s and the 1970s to bring animals into sociology. But since the 1990s, we've seen quite a swell of considering non-human animals within the social world and using that sociological toolkit to analyze the kind of complex and problematic ways that humans are entangled with non-human others, and think about power relations and think about discourse and the mechanisms of our society and the growth of modernity that was very much entwined with non-human animal exploitation. So in sociology, we see a really rich toolkit of theoretical tools that we can use And something that I love about sociology, this isn't in the intro, I've gone off script already, sorry, Josephine. But something that I really love about sociology is that there's just like a theoretical and a methodological specificity that some might say means we're just a little bit too tightly wound about theory and methods. But I think it gives us a really interesting way to unpack human, non-human animal relations in a way that's very tangible and in a way that we can kind of apply to our everyday lives and use to really unpick things and get to the crux of where these power relations come from and what we might want to unlearn so that we can relearn something different and learn to live less badly with other animals. So the crux of our introduction is really just making a case for that this is a point in time where we have an opportunity to reimagine. We've got kind of a breakdown of our social norms that means we could build something different. And we have a theoretical and a methodological toolkit that might let us do that. So the point of the book from there was really to bring together people who were kind of at the forefront of multi-species sociological thinking, who were willing to write a chapter during a pandemic, and could lend their expertise to giving us different slices of human, non-human animal life so that we have these points of contact that we might want to think through if we want to reimagine. So we've got a whole spread of chapters that capture wide ranges of kind of human-animal interfaces, and each one of them gives us just a different slice of multi-species sociology and a different idea of how we might reimagine and what we might unlearn in this very mixed opportunity that we had through the pandemic. So overall, we would like that in our current context of global challenges and pandemics and climate change, that we all took an opportunity to pause and reflect and unlearn some of the problematic things that you'll read about in the book. And we haven't done it yet, but you know, there's still time. So I think that's the crux of our introduction. Does that cover it, Josephine?
That was very good. Thank you. Thank you very much. All right. So a few of our contributors can't be here this evening. One of these is Catherine Oliver. Catherine Oliver has written about the chicken city, and I'm just going to read out a few words of Catherine's. Chickens have been invited to live in cities in increasing numbers, and London is no exception. The city has become home to thousands of domestic chickens. Domestic hen keeping has only grown in the face of ecological, environmental, and ethical crises. During the COVID-19 pandemic, perhaps surprisingly, a surge in interest for hens at rehoming organisations indicated that zoonotic disease was not a barrier to bringing fowl into the home, but an opportunity for new modes of living as people began to live with and learn about chickens in their domestic space. New interspecies sociabilities emerged. Drawing on interviews with chicken rehomers, this chapter explores how, in the chicken city, destabilisations of the normal have created pockets of potential resistance within the city. So as you can see, Catherine is based in London. The next chapter is Zoe's.
Thank you. I came up quicker than I had remembered. Great. So my chapter, unsurprisingly, was about human companion animal relationships during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm building on that idea that during the pandemic, we were all sent home. So, well, not all of us, but a lot of us were sent home. So we were very much living in the same kind of environment that our pets were. So during the day, we spent all of our living time with them. We had a lot of opportunity to observe them and rethink our human companion animal relationships. And I was really interested to see whether anything about the reporting of human companion animal relationships changed over the pandemic, when humans were kind of kept home with their animals all of the time. They couldn't ignore what their daily lived reality looked like. Would anything about the way that we spoke about pets in this time period change? Cliff notes, no. But I did a media review between 2019 and 2020, the end of 2020, just to see if in that very early period of lockdown, we started to see any kind of interesting things coming out of our media representation of human companion animal relationships. And what I found, disappointingly but unsurprisingly, is that when we have really intense time living at home with companion animals, it didn't necessarily reflect any kind of rethinking of human-pet relations in everyday life, or even the ethics of pet keeping. I kind of was hopeful. I don't know why I have hope as a sociologist. But I was hopeful that if you had to spend time with someone all of the time who was confined to your house, who was very restricted in their movement, if you saw the way that they navigated space, you might become a little bit more aware of the barriers that they faced. But what we actually saw during the pandemic is that pet ownership rates skyrocketed. They went from 61% of households to 69% of households in Australia. And our media narratives very heavily doubled down on commodification and very human-centric narratives of what it was like to be a human living with pets during the pandemic. So we talk about pets as good for health, the many positives of living with pets during the pandemic. Pets are very much a lifeline for the human animals who lived with them, so that they had human contact, they had touch, very, very little consideration of anything to do with non-human animal experiences, or even whether that touch was wanted or whether animals wanted to be commodified. So really what we saw during the pandemic in a kind of time period where we had an opportunity to rethink these companion animals is just a doubling down on commodification in the pet industrial complex. And so in this chapter, I really wanted to sit with that because I think that's old news. Like well, I shouldn't say we all know. I think it's a given that like pets are an exploitative relationship. But I thought the pandemic gave us an opportunity not just to rethink that, but to also look at the way that humans relate to all others and start asking the question that, we always talk about good companion animals and prescribing pets because pets are good for humans, but we don't really ask the question whether humans are good companions for anybody else. And we have this period where we were confined to our houses. We could start to re-engage with the multi-species life that we lived. I think this gives us an opportunity to critically examine how we kind of relate with the non-human world and start thinking about that idea of companionship beyond commodified companionship. If you spend a lot of time with the multi-species world, what does it mean to make yourself as a human into a good companion? What does it mean if you've taken custodianship of a parcel of land or of a living space to have responsibility to provide a hospitable environment for all of the others who live there and not just for yourself and the things that make you feel comfortable? So really, I was interested in unpacking some of that, unpacking the anthropological norms that we see in human-pet relationships and starting to think whether we have any kind of breadcrumbs that will help us move beyond humans and beyond this idea of commodified companionships so that we can all become better friends rather than fair weather friends who relinquished all of our animals as soon as the pandemic was over.
Thank you, Zoe. So this chapter is by Nick Taylor and Heather Fraser, as you can see. Heather is the current president of the Australasian Animal Studies Association, and unfortunately, Nick and Heather can't be with us this evening for very good reasons. So I'm just going to read a few words of theirs out about their chapter. Critical and radical approaches to human-animal studies owe a clear debt to feminist ways of thinking, yet animal rights feminist contributions are often overlooked or downplayed by both mainstream feminism and human-animal studies. Iterations of ecofeminism draw attention to the interlinked nature of the oppression of the environment and women, and later to vegan feminist animal studies. This chapter argues that feminisms and animal studies have much to gain by more actively dialoguing with each other. Underpinning this is our intersectional understanding of multi-species relations based on the recognition and respect for difference, reciprocity, and mutual care. Our impetus is to advance the rights of all oppressed groups, including non-human animals, in a time described as the new normal. I chose a cow image for Heather and Nick's work because they've done quite a lot of work with dairy cows and dairy farmers. So the second part of our book is activism. And Zoe, you were going to speak to Linda's chapter because Linda also can't be with us.
Absolutely. For anyone familiar with Linda Cohen-Bockus, you'll know that she does a lot of work around early socialization of children into anti-animal social norms. And so this kind of builds on some of the work she's done around the Peppa Pig paradox, looking at the way that children are socialized into primarily consuming animals through food, but also through a range of different other practices in early childhood learning and in primary schooling. And this chapter very much built on that work. So she was looking at early socialization and the kind of structural barriers that vegan families face when they come into contact with places like learning institutions and the various kind of environments that their children are put into as they grow up. And so what she found is that not only do we have kind of species as practices embedded into the fiber of everyday life, which we very much know, but you also start to see parallels to a range of structural barriers. So she talks about class and gender, and also just an intense amount of stigmatization of vegan families. So the way that she sees these structural barriers manifest is largely through things like media and representation. So children's media usually reinforces species as views through stereotypical portrayals of animals. And again, refer to a Peppa Pig article. It is excellent. And also the chapter in this book, which is excellent and builds on that as well. and primarily the education system. So I think her work around the education system is where this chapter really stands out. So she looks through a lot of different school activities that unknowingly reinforce speciesist perspectives. Even though there's evidence that young children naturally show less speciesism, education practices often work very much against this inherent compassion that children have. And if you look at it through an intersectional lens, she found that vegan children often face multiple forms of discrimination if they belong to other minority groups, as well as being vegan, which, even though it's now a protected class in the UK, still faces a whole lot of stigma and exclusion at the same time. So she finishes this chapter by basically concluding that educators and caregivers have a responsibility to acknowledge and incorporate vegan ethics into their practice. And these compassionate children could really be instrumental in creating that positive change for the future. So for Linda, this is really an area that we need to pay a lot of attention to through the socialization of children. We're seeing like the next generation of vegan, animal rights, compassionate global citizens. So we really need to think about these early learning center practices and the responsibilities that educators have to nurture compassion rather than stomp it out through prioritizing animal exploitation over more compassionate practices.
Thank you. Hence I chose the pig. Beautiful pig. Nick, I would like to throw to you in Melbourne.
Hi, everyone. But yeah, thanks, Josephine and Zoe. I wanted to start things off, actually. I do have two of my dogs here who are protesting me doing my animal studies work, somewhat ironically. But I also wanted to bring in, I've mentioned that at a previous vegan sociology conference, and I wanted to bring in a different example I haven't mentioned before. So I wanted to go back to my dog Charlie, who lived with me while I was writing my PhD thesis, and I wanted to sort of start with my acknowledgement I gave to Charlie in my PhD acknowledgement. So finally, I'd like to thank my dog Charlie for being an amazing companion and for constantly showing me that we are not the only species who have complex emotional lives. So that it's definitely a big influence for me thinking about animals and constantly reminded of that. Maybe if I could skip to the next slide and get into my chapter itself. Yeah, so I wanted to start things off actually with a quote, not actually from my chapter, but something I've seen since. So I recently watched the Netflix series Live to 100 Secrets of Blue Zones. I don't know if anyone has seen that one, but it's all about areas of the world where people live to 100, like lots of people live to 100, and what are they doing, and sort of plant-based eating or more plant-based eating was in there as well, but a bunch of other things. But like, what are we doing? Like, what are they doing? And he's in America, the guy who did the documentary. What could we do in America to be doing these same things and live longer, live healthier, etc.? And the quote which kind of finished the documentary was, America within the next 10 years could be a blue zone. All we have to do is shift the focus from thinking that we're going to change 330 million people's minds to changing their environment. And so I thought that was kind of relevant when we think about veganism. We're often thinking, well, we've got an animal-based food system, but we want to try and make individuals choose the vegan option within this non-vegan system. And I guess this chapter is thinking of, yes, we can continue to do that, but also we did think about the changing the system, which is kind of the conclusion he came to around sort of healthy choices as well. We need to sort of make the system more healthier rather than focusing on individual choices. And so I guess that's what that chapter was about or is about. And yeah, unlike a lot of work in this space, including my own, it's a very direct intervention in social movement. So it's not just like maybe there's something in that could be relevant. I was actually going, here is what we're saying, which is often very individual focused, often focused on a hypocrisy narrative, environmentalists of hypocritical for not being vegan, those kind of things. What would it look like if we thought about more systems, about governments, about system change? And so when it comes to the climate movement, which is one of my case studies, I've given alternative messaging, no new animal agriculture, a just transition for animal agriculture workers, 100% plant-based agriculture by 2030. What would messaging look like if we take that sociological idea that thinks about structures, not just individual choices? So yeah, that is my time, and that is what my chapter was about. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nick. Thank you. So now we're up to the next section of the book, which is thinking about speciesist relations. And this is Dinesh's chapter. Dinesh Waddiwell.
Hi all, and congratulations, Josephine and Zoe, for steering this fantastic collection along. In some ways, my chapter follows neatly on from Nick's, which I guess I'm interested in the structural questions. Class is a fundamental sociological category. And there's some different ways we can think about class. Lots of the ways that we often think about class in an everyday way is, I would say, social, in the way that we think about, say, middle class. But I was particularly interested in structural analyses of class, and particularly Karl Marx's economic analysis of class. In the classic Marxist view of class, what defines capitalism is that the labour power of human workers is commodified and alienated, and this becomes the source of surplus for capitalism. So Marx would make the argument that what marks out capitalism is it leaps upon the labour power of human workers, it extracts surplus, and this is what drives the overproduction and the profitability of capitalism. I was particularly interested in, well, could this be applied to animals? And in some respects, this chapter extends on work that I've done previously, and particularly the book that I released last year called Animals and Capital. In the chapter, I make an argument that actually, if we look at animals and if we use the building blocks that Marx provides us, we can recognize that not only are animals a class under capitalism, but they're also a class that's distinct from the human working class. The reason I make that argument is that where the human worker is usually forced to just sell their labour power, animals enter into production in multiple forms. They enter as raw materials that are used as the raw materials that are worked on by production. They leave, unfortunately, dead as products. And they are asked to work on themselves through a kind of metabolic labour. We don't have time to get into the full theory about the metabolic labour, but the point I make in the chapter is that actually looking at this tells us that animals are to be a hybrid of some different factors or value positions, according to Marx's theory of value. And as a result, they actually occupy different structural positions. In my view, there's a couple of important implications. One is that it gives us a different way to look at the labour force that is the mass number of animals that are in our food system. So at this point, probably at any one point at the moment, we're talking about 35 billion land animals who are alive in animal agriculture systems, and maybe 1 to 200 billion fish in aquaculture systems. Finally, I think it's important to recognizing that animals are a class but differentiated from humans. It's useful in being able to tell us that we can't necessarily assume solidarity between the interests of the human working class and the animal working class. In some respects, I'd say this reflects lots of the tensions that animal advocates face every day in trying to convince humans to make change for animals. If you want to flip the slide, Josephine. And I just wanted to share, firstly, the cover of the book that I mentioned, Animals and Capital, but also this image. So this image comes from the Australian artist, Yvette Watt. This image, I think, is about 15 years old. It's actually painted on, you won't be able to see it in the image, in the picture, but this is painted on a tea towel, and the medium is the artist's blood. I was lucky enough to see these images about 15 years ago in a gallery, and they just blew me away. And I feel completely honoured that Yvette allowed me to have one of these images on Animals and Capital. And one reason I like this image is that this is a resistive animal, and lots of the book, it describes animals that are defiantly staring down capital as capital seeks to exploit and subsume them within the value system of the economic system. That's enough from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dinesh. Thank you. So the next chapter is Erica Cudworth's. Erica? Is Erica here? I know she wasn't well on Monday. Can you see if... No? Zoe, can you speak to Erica's chapter?
If you give me 1 second to remind my brain what we're on. Yes, we can speak to it very briefly. So Erica's chapter was about using bordering theory to understand species relations as a response to COVID-19. So Erica writes about, during the COVID-19 pandemic, human publics became more aware now than ever of the present and threat of zoonotic pandemics, especially those originating in non-human animals with microbial agents transmitting from non-human to human bodies. And in that article, she kind of takes as a starting point that the dominant discourses around these politics have really reflected our colonial present, peoples and practices from the continents of Africa and Asia being demonized. So this dominant discourse is really driven by contradictory demands of the capitalist scene for business as usual. And in light of this, the predominant political response to zoonotic pandemic has been bordering and rebordering practices. And we saw that very much with the opening and closing and restriction of movement of many different bodies throughout the pandemic. So we saw restriction of travel, mobility for some humans, attempting to limit trades in live animals and increasing surveillance of everyday practices at food markets. So what the COVID-19 pandemic really illustrated is that this kind of bordering, whether it was constituted by high politics or cultural, economic, or social activities, is a process that's found in a multiplicity of places and one that reveals the extent of our bio-insecurity. And so she very much looks through the lens of Foucault's biopolitics to understand how our human and non-human life world interacts and how our objects of power manifest in our response to the COVID-19 pandemic and our use of bordering theory. And so I think in this article, she really delivers an interesting use of bordering theory, an interesting theoretical contribution, and also an interesting understanding of the way that we kind of responded to the pandemic in relational ways through control and control of bodies and control of relations. That might be the best I can do on no notice.
That's great. Thank you. Unfortunately, yeah, Erica isn't well this week. Okay, so the next chapter is Matthew Cole. I think Matthew is here to speak to your chapter, Matthew.
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Just trying to get my video going. Hello, good morning. Yeah, thank you so much for this event and for giving me the chance to write this chapter. And I should say what you said, Josephine, at the beginning totally resonated with my inspiration about sociology being really good at estranging us from the familiar. And unfortunately, speciesism is about the most familiar thing that we all inhabit in various ways across the planet, I think. And the real sort of motivation behind this chapter was just being permanently annoyed, pissed off, astonished at the ludicrousness of speciesism and how it endures despite its ludicrousness. So I thought a good way to highlight this was to make a connection between an event that kind of entered my consciousness as a news event on the BBC News website, and to link that to a storyline from a Batman comic called The Laughing Fish, which came out in 1978. So that's a panel from that comic there with the Joker. And how was I able to make that connection? So the story that emerged was this organization called the CFPO, the Cornish Fish Production Organization, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. So interesting immediately that human beings are claiming that they produce fish producers organization. That's fucked up for a start. But anyway, one of their schemes was to rebrand two species of aquatic creatures, megrim soles. We have a megrim sole pictured on the slide, and spider crabs. The reason being that they lost the market for these creatures after Brexit. So they were exported to Spain where they were consumed. Brexit happens, that messed up trade relations and all that kind of thing. So they wanted to find a new market in Britain. So their strategy for doing that was to rebrand, i.e. discursively reconstruct these species. So they renamed spider crabs as Cornish king crabs, and they renamed megrim soles as Cornish soles. So making a connection between a kind of valued aspect of national identity, because Cornwall has this really positive image in Britain as a kind of tourist destination and something that's associated with positivity and good times and so on. And the use of the word king with all its patriarchal overtones as well as nationalist overtones for the UK, all kinds of stuff going on there, which I don't have time to get into. But the key point I was taking away from that was how ludicrous this is and how arrogant this is, that human beings take it upon ourselves to discursively reconstruct species to facilitate their continued victimization, rather than take this as an opportunity. Okay, the market's collapsed, let's do something else. And of course, governmental support and all the rest of it would have been required, but that's the way we should be going. Instead of that, it's no, how can we keep killing? So the connection I made there with the comic was that in this storyline, in The Laughing Fish, the Joker's scheme is to poison the waters of Gotham Harbour, which causes all the fishes in the harbour to get his rictus grin, his visage. And then he tries to assert ownership, like intellectual property rights over all the fishes, and take a cut of the profits from every fish product that's sold as a result. And of course, Batman thwarts the scheme. And in the comic, this is ridiculous. It's self-evidently ridiculous, because that is the Joker's character, to be basically a representation of irrationality, selfishness, all negative characteristics, with Batman as the kind of flip side of that, and disciplining him and reasserting rationality. But I thought, actually, no, he's doing exactly the same thing as the Cornish Fish Producers Organisation. He's asserting that he can just rebrand these species, assert property rights over them, profit from their exploitation. And I thought also, what a shame that there's such a missed opportunity there, because what the Joker is doing is highlighting the absurdity of this whole process. So rather than using that as an opportunity to say, hey, isn't this all ridiculous? Unfortunately, the comic reasserts human property rights over other creatures, as indeed the Fish Producers Organisation did later. So really, yeah, what I was trying to do here is just juxtapose these two very different examples to show, look, this is fucking ridiculous. And that drives everything I've done for the last 20 years, is that just, I can't get over what absolute nonsense this all is. So yeah, I'll stop there, because I'm clearly ranting already and I could go on. But anyway, thank you again for letting me share this work.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Thank you. As I said to you, many students are very excited and interested in your work because of these links that you make to popular culture. Okay, now we're up to my chapter. So my chapter concludes the book, although I think Corey is hopefully with us and able to speak to her chapter after mine. She asked to go late for various reasons. So in this chapter, I am speaking to Laura Jean McKay's amazing book, The Animals in That Country. And I'm really querying this construction of dystopia and utopia, and looking at that through the sociological imagination. So the sociological imagination is a really important idea in sociology that really challenges us as sociologists to work hard to link biography and history, similar to what Nick and Dinesh have both been talking about, linking these ideas about structures with individual agency and individual experience. So sociology has always been interested in literature, and in fact, at the foundational years of sociology, there was a debate about the place of literature and whether or not literature itself should be what sociology learned from and developed as a critique of societies. And particularly sociologists from that have developed a real interest in thinking about utopias as ways of imagining better futures, because, as I said, sociologists are interested in gathering information to critique society and think about how we might live better and how we might increase justice. So usually this obviously has focused on human futures. And I guess in all of this work, we are trying to bring forward the construction of thinking about futures for more than human animals. So a recent argument has been made by a couple of sociologists about the usefulness of dystopian literature. So I took that argument up and looked at this book, this book is The Animals in That Country, a speculative pandemic dystopia that by incredible coincidence, despite having taken 10 years to write, was released during the first COVID lockdown in, I think, March in Melbourne 2020. So I use this idea of utopia and dystopia and the sociological imagination to really question who this whole construction of the book as a dystopia. For whom is it a dystopia? Because, of course, a world that is dystopic is recognizing a relationship to social power. Whether or not you construct your social world as dystopic or utopic or somewhere in between is actually about your relationship to social structures and institutions. So that for many animals right now, as well as an increasing range of humans, particularly with rising pandemic climate crises in particular, we are already living in dystopias, and other animals are obviously clearly frequently living in dystopias. So the shift towards dystopian worlds is expanding due to the climate crisis and associated environmental degradations and species loss. So two of the things about this book make it really interesting for sociological thought. It introduces a really sophisticated, more than human biography, because in this book, McKay has a co-protagonist who is a dingo hybrid. There's a pandemic spreading from Melbourne in this book, and it enables communications between humans and other animals. So we start to learn about the dingo hybrid's name is Sue, and Sue takes a road trip with the human protagonist, Jean, and we start to learn about Sue's view of the world, Sue's individuality, Sue's needs, and Sue's opinions and thoughts about the world that they're experiencing together. So it's not just Sue that Jean starts to hear from and be able to communicate with. It's obviously through this idea of the road trip, they meet a whole range of different animals. So through this, McKay is able to critique things like farmed animals, dairy cows, whales, a whole range of animals used for tourism, the whole range of different relations that we have with other animals. So in effect, she makes the familiar strange, which is a very well-known sociological term, which is part of what our work is, to make the familiar strange, by challenging the reader to think about what other animals think of us, what their experience of the world is, and what their individual needs and wants are in the constructions that they're in, which are dominated by humans. So this whole dystopic narrative is able to upset the norm and create a world in which we can rethink. So the biographies of non-humans in this book become linked to history. So it extends the sociological imagination to apply it to more than human lives. Secondly, I just want to make mention that the book title is in dialogue with Margaret Atwood's earlier poetry collection and her titular poem from that collection, which mourns the destruction of First Nations perspectives in Canada. So it's Atwood's work is looking in a mourning way to the past, invoking Indigenous epistemologies in this country, Australia, as well. So Atwood writes in her poem that the animals in that country have the faces of people. They are in relation to humans in a very different way to our now dominating Western neoliberal constructions. So by framing the novel in this way, with this dialogue with Margaret Atwood's work, McKay is really challenging us to consider worldviews that value other animals very differently to the dominating views that we have normalised, and to think about futures that might be different, therefore. The novel suggests in this evocation of decolonising our own thinking that the world was and is and can be otherwise. It also suggests that the communication barrier between humans and other animals, which is often used to justify human domination, is itself a construct that denies our mutual capacities to understand in order to justify abuse and exploitation. So the challenge of this novel then is a question of whether we are willing to listen and by implication challenge and change our own behaviours in response to attending to more than human worlds. Corey, I'm wondering if Corey has arrived. Zoe, can you see Corey?
Sorry, I see
Hello,
W.
I'm here.
Yeah.
I can't use video though.
Hey, Corey.
Hello.
Happy birthday.
Oh, thank you for remembering.
I also just wanted to bring in the inspiration, one of the inspirations for my work. The original inspiration is a rabbit called Ben. And I guess this picture really is just about getting down to someone else's level, looking from a different point of view, to think about living with and beside, rather than in dominating relationships as we think about the challenges going into the future. So now I will hand over to Corey. Corey's chapter is actually from the activism section of our book, but Corey requested to go at the end this morning. So good morning, Corey.
Thank you. Yes, I'm currently phoning in from Ireland right now. We're here for Samhain. So it is 8:20 in the morning. So thanks. I'll make this very quick. I've only got, I think, 2 slides after this one. So basically, this was a replication study of, so it's actually quite fitting. I'm going after Matthew. It's a replication study of Matthew's that was done during the COVID era. And basically, I was looking at British newspapers. If you could flip to the next slide.
My screen just, oh, cool.
There it goes. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, we did a sample. Oh, I did a sample of 420 UK newspaper articles, and this is a big change from Matthew and Heron's article because they had, I think they did their sample was just the whole number. So that was a major change, was that the number of mentions of veganism in newspapers in Britain had really, really exploded. So I had to take a sample. And then I basically coded for positive, negative, and was there a mention of COVID? And it was a little bit more complicated than that, but just to get the gist of the findings here. One of the other major shifts was it was a quite positive sample. So in the previous study, which was done, I think they did their coding about 10 years before me. Most of theirs, I believe, was quite negative. And the big change was this was quite positive. And the reason for that was that most of them had to do with products and services. So it's a pretty clear indication that veganism had really been commodified, which allowed it to be normalized in the popular media and in the marketplace. Another consequence of that was that only one of those 420 articles in my sample actually centered non-human animals. And that one I think is, that one is actually, I've got a screenshot of that over in the corner there. About a fourth of the articles were neutral, but once again, those were just about products and services. So just kind of like flatly saying this is a new vegan thing that is there, neither positively or negatively. So usually these would be articles that were pumping up, like, oh, here's the new Greg's sausage roll and it tastes so great. So another indication that the mainstream media now has become a way to kind of platform products and services, maybe a good indication of the downward spiral that we've seen in the media as being in a space of independent, trustworthy news, now just kind of being a place to push products. So yeah, about a fourth of that was negative. A lot of that had to do with veganism being framed as dangerous or difficult. But interestingly, I did code whether or not was it a right, left, or central newspaper. And the right-leaning newspapers were about as equal as the left-leaning newspapers to frame veganism as positive or negative, including The Guardian, which we all love and adore. The Guardian was one of the crappiest ones. Like, they were always trashing on veganism for some reason, so that was a bit shocking. As for COVID, really very little mention of COVID. When COVID was mentioned in relation to veganism, it might, 5% of the cases, it was a motivator for veganism, or it was it was highlighting that, oh, COVID is the reason that people are shopping and are changing their shopping patterns. And, you know, because there's a lot of like back home, what's the word? Like homesteading. Yeah. People doing a lot more gardening, that kind of stuff. I remember when I went on the gardening website in March, you had to get into a queue to get in there because people were so into, which really, I don't know, had to do much with veganism, more to do with this kind of homesteading response to COVID. So my next slide, please, my last slide. So just summarizing.
Oh, do you want me to just put them?
Yeah, sorry, I forgot I had those animations on there.
That's okay.
Yeah, so just to summarize, what we found, or what I found rather, was that veganism was predominantly presented as positively in British newspapers, which is great. However, almost every single one had to do with veganism as being a type of consumerism. And also, there really wasn't a relationship with COVID. Like I said, only about 5% related veganism and COVID, and then 10% had to do with new shopping patterns, people eating more greens and things like that. So COVID-19, I think this is a missed opportunity. What there was really in the UK only one organization, that was Viva, that was trying to, at least some of the time, frame COVID as an opportunity for people to go vegan because this is a consequence of our negative relationship with other animals. But otherwise, other animal rights organizations, vegan organizations, were pretty much mute on this, which is really a shame because it was a response to non-vegan lifestyles that we had this pandemic. And yeah, a lot of this was just about products and services. If you can flip them all the way, I think of a couple more. Yeah, so the vegophobia that Cole and Morgan had pointed out 10 years prior, it seems to have been cured. There's a lot more positivity, but again, this is undermining veganism, I would argue, because it had nothing to do with animal rights and everything to do with buy. And so a real sort of, an undermining of the political potential of veganism. Boo hiss. And that's all from me. Thanks, Josephine.
Thank you. Thanks, Corey, and for getting up early. Really appreciate it. Okay, so I hope this has just been an enticing summary of our collection. If anyone's interested in encouraging their libraries to purchase, there's a 20% discount code. I think Chantel has some flyers to put in the chat, which has the code. If anyone's interested in contacting us about podcasts or book clubs or chats or anything, Zoe and I have our information there. And now, Zoe, if you could run the Q&A, that would be terrific.
I sure can. I think folks are still mulling over their questions. Thank you, everyone, for your presentations and for your time. It is nice to hear what all of you are writing about. I enjoyed reading them at the time, but my brain is now like swamped them all, so it was nice to have a bit of a refresher. Does anyone have a burning question they would like to ask? Feel free to raise your hand. Otherwise, I will abuse my privileges as chair of the Q&A and just pick on everyone who deemed to show up. Yuki already has the book. I'm very impressed because I don't have the book yet. Okay, I have a question that might be a little bit of an unfair one. Sorry. But as I'm listening to everyone speak and I am reflecting on your chapters and thinking about where we're at now at the end of 2024, I'm hearing a lot of missed opportunity after COVID, and I'm not necessarily seeing a lot of positive changes in our human non-human animal relations in response to our increasing climate events and natural disasters and things that seem to be very obviously worsening. Does anyone feel like there is signs of hope that have come out of things like the pandemic that we might change things around animals, or do we all just feel sad and defeated?
No hope on mine, sorry.
Yeah, it's not looking good. I'm seeing a lot of like stunned faces of Can I pick on you, Dinesh, for a second? It's related to your chapter, but only kind of. I wanted to ask you about the relations between slaughterhouse workers and slaughterhouse worker rights and non-human animal rights through the pandemic, when we started to see some acknowledgement of the interlinked exploitation in those industries. Do you see anything kind of fruitful or hopeful happening in those conversations?
Thanks, sorry.
Sorry.
I mean, if we took we don't have to, but if we took a really structural understanding of how alliances happen in that kind of, let's say, a Marxist point of view, it's contradiction and crisis that generates alliances. So what we saw in the pandemic was a situation where actually workers in animal agriculture were sent to work, and some of them were sent to their death to produce meat for human populations. I mean, we directly saw their lives being endangered to produce meat. And in some respects, this should have been the trigger for alliance building between animal advocates and trade unions and those who advocate for worker rights. We didn't really see that. There was a little bit of stuff as far as I was aware in the US where animal advocacy organisations shared messaging, I guess, with trade unions. But we didn't see the kind of alliances that could have sprung up from that kind of crisis. To me, actually, the lesson is, firstly, as we all know, animal advocates, and I think actually Corey's presentation highlighted this with that image about the Guardian and veganism. We've got a long way to go in terms of moving the left generally. And one thing I'd say about the fact that there's no difference between, say, left-wing papers and right-wing papers is that John Sampan Motsu many years ago made the comment that one thing the left and right all agree on is human supremacy. So this is a problem we have as animal advocates. But the second side of that what we saw in the pandemic is that I think also animal advocates have some work to do to build the conditions for alliances with labour movements. Because I think, again, if the message we got from the pandemic is it'll happen again, I think what we know is that there's going to be various crises in the future, and these crises will push different divergent social movements together who suddenly find themselves with shared interests. And as advocates, we need to be ready for that. So that's something I'd say is a horribly structural perspective on alliance building. But I think that would be my take on the pandemic.
No, thank you for that response to a very left field question. I had seen you do another talk on it, so I didn't feel too mean about it, but I appreciate your response. And I'm going to pick on Corey and Nick now anyway, so this is how it goes. Corey and Nick, you're both talking about activism, and I feel like, Nick, when you were talking about structural responses, and Corey, when you were talking about this real lean into plant-based capitalism, really, I have a very unformed question around plant-based capitalism. Like, we know that this is kind of a thing that's increasing. It's not necessarily the kind of change we need that's going to lead us to an animal rights agenda. What do we do about plant-based capitalism, folks? Tell me.
You want to go first, Corey, or?
Yeah, just because you can't see it, so I don't have my camera, sorry. I don't know, but gosh, it is saying something though, isn't it? When Matthew and Karen first did there for that study, they had just like 400 mentions of veganism. And here, 10 years later, it's 41,000 mentions of veganism. That has to count for something. And as far as normalizing it, at least as just a diet. However, it is absolutely shocking, isn't it, when really only one article is centering non-human animals. So even with the Viva campaigns, those were just talking about climate change. They weren't really talking about animals, were they? So I don't know, but I think this is the kind of research we need to keep doing to actually demonstrate the impact that capitalism is having on our movement. And it should be something for serious consideration, especially at the big nonprofits who really have made that compromise years ago that they're going to work with capitalism and not against it. And we need to see more evidence of that demonstrates, well, not just what's going on in the marketplace where we see that animals aren't being mentioned, but then when you see what's coming out of the big nonprofits who have now committed to this bureaucratic style, professionalized style, working 9 to 5, getting paychecks regularly and getting these giant grants regularly in order to stay basically in business, to use that phrase. they've made that compromise a long time ago to stop mentioning non-human animals, stop pushing for veganism. Veganism, I think, has become culturally relevant or known about, not really so much because of the large nonprofits, but because of grassroots activists who've pushed for it nonetheless. And I've done, by the way, in the past content analyses of the type of things that are being promoted by the campaigns that are being pushed by these nonprofits. And you see time and time again, as they turn towards capitalism and become a professionalized nonprofit, their message changes almost overnight to erase non-human animals or switch to welfare or go back to reducitarianism, and veganism gets omitted. So it's happening on both sides. It's not just the marketplace, it's the nonprofit sector, it's the movement itself getting sucked into the marketplace. And so I think we need to take a look at not just, how veganism is getting warped in the public sphere, but how we ourselves are representing veganism to that public sphere. That's all.
I guess, yeah, I'll link that, I guess, to the question of hope. I guess one thing I've seen, I don't know if people can kind of see, but I guess I can't really see my hands, but like, I feel like we've got like plant and animal base. And I feel like there's quite a large people, if we've got like animal base and plant base, there's quite a large portion of people who are quite keen, or at least happy with, if we tip that scale towards more of a plant-based food system. And I think that is progress. Most of those people are not vegans themselves, but there's pretty sort of broad philosophical support for veganism, or at least for more plant-based eating, whether that's on environmental grounds or health grounds or whatever else. But it is like a limited hope, I guess. And in building on Corey's points, most of it is not connected to animals. But yeah, I guess that sort of is what my chapter is engaging with. Like, there's this pretty broad support for shifting the system in a plant-based direction. Like, what do we do with that? And yeah, I think we should engage with it, but I also think we should bring animals in as well. It's a complicated question. And I guess on the capitalism question, yeah, I think it definitely is a barrier, and it definitely, I think, absolutely, as Corey's touched on, helps to explain the idea like veganism has become more mainstream, more normalized, but it's more about consuming vegan products. It's not about social justice, because that fits so well with capitalism. You can buy more products, you can buy green products, vegan products, etc. Whereas like a more social justice ethic is less consistent with capitalism. So yeah, I don't have anything great to say about that, but it is a barrier for sure.
Yeah, sure. And I'm going to do another unfair question. Sorry, Matthew, because it's not what your chapter's about. But because Corey was doing a replication study of one of your studies, do you have any thoughts on this as well?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I mean, when we did the original study, we also found this, what at the time was surprising, finding that veganism was separated from animal rights in its representation in the news media. So we really didn't expect that. We thought they'd be conflated, and yeah, we thought that would be a negative conflation. Look at these, crazy vegan animal rights people. But no, even back then, it was more, where there was anything positive, it was mostly in terms of uh, products or lifestyle, if you like, and not about animal rights. So that stayed consistent in a bad way. So, but in terms of like, I mean, one of the things that gives me a bit of hope maybe is thinking about the UK context. Maybe there's a social justice window of opportunity in terms of the protected characteristic, legal standing of veganism now. So, for example, where I work at the OU, we're just starting to work with a student intern about the representation of veganism in our teaching materials. I mean, across the whole university. Well, we won't be able to do the whole university, so we'll have to do a sample of teaching materials. And so to have institutional support and recognition that that is worthwhile, to look for the way that vegans are represented, and if any of that is problematic or negatively stereotyped, therefore we ought to change that. I think that's a positive move, and that's kind of, well, it's not really opposing capitalism, plant-based capitalism as such, but it's saying veganism is certainly about more than that, and not really about that at all in that kind of example. So I think that kind of thing gives me some hope, because of course that won't end there. We will then do something with the findings and publish and so on, and hopefully make some of that useful in a campaigning sense for other universities, other workplaces, that kind of stuff. So that's given us a sort of weird way forward, possibly, because when that first happened, the protected characteristic thing, I was a bit ambiguous about it, because I thought, well, in a way, this might be just reducing the power of veganism and saying, oh, it's just just a belief system, right? But what I mean by that is, alongside all these other ones that need respect, but that's all they need, you know. We don't need to respond to it in terms of completely restructuring society and dismantling speciesism and all its institutional supports. But yeah, I've moved from there to be a bit more positive now. I felt like, oh, there's something we could actually do as sociologists, as, you know, activists as well. So that's a bit of a tangential answer to your question, because I mean, I don't have a direct answer for the plant-based capitalism thing. But, well, there is a sort of link maybe, because in some ways it's made it more difficult being a vegan in everyday life, because we've got this proliferation of plant-based labeling and presentation of products. So after this sort of weird, utopian's putting it too strongly, but this weird sort of positive period where it became much easier to find vegan food and other products as a vegan, it's only become more difficult again, because all this stuff labeled plant-based, you know, you have to start checking labels. So we got to the point of, oh, I don't have to stand around in shops and supermarkets for ages scrutinizing the ingredients list. But you can't trust plant-based. It doesn't necessarily mean vegan, or even vegetarian in some cases, which is sort of mind-blowing, because it doesn't have this legal framing that veganism does. So it's taken us back in some respects and made being vegan more difficult, and maybe therefore it's more difficult to generalize it, broaden it out across the population.
Matthew, for people who are in other countries and aren't aware of that, can you just explain what you're talking about there, that legal change?
Yeah, so there's I can't remember when it came in, but the Equality Act in the UK was a major piece of legislation which enshrined religious or philosophical beliefs as protected characteristics under UK law. So in other words, it became illegal to discriminate against people on the basis of holding one of these characteristics, one or more of these characteristics. So veganism is included, and that was tested in, I think, an employment tribunal case a few years ago, where a vegan won a case for unfair treatment on the basis of being a vegan. So we've got, you know, some institutional support there. So that, yeah, maybe gives us an opportunity. Well, I think it certainly does in all kinds of situations, like workplace situations, to push back against. So, for instance, things like vegans not being given vegan equipment to do their jobs, such as if you need to wear heavy boots, being provided with non-leather boots, all that kind of thing. And also gives us a way to push back against vegans being bullied at work, or, you know, denied work opportunities because of being vegan, all of that sort of thing. So yeah, I think it is broadly positive, but I did have that initial sort of concern that it might be a way of sort of just marginalizing veganism in a different kind of way. But I'm a bit more hopeful about that now. So I hope that makes sense.
It does. I'm glad there's a little bit of hope in the panel. It makes me feel less sad for the world. And while I've got you, and please feel free to raise your hand if you have questions. Otherwise, I am just going to keep going, because that is what I do. Josephine and Matthew, you've both kind of engaged with different texts to do your analysis for this book. And I'm wondering, you know, we've got this burgeoning field of sociological fiction where we start to see sociology increasingly get involved in not just analyzing text, but also creating text as well. And I am curious to hear what you think. Like, what do the texts of the future look like? To get to something that you would like to see in terms of change for multi-species relations, what do you want to see in, like, the future of our cultural texts?
Do you want me to comment? I was going to say, I think there is hope in the kinds of things that are being published. I mean, like the fact that books like Laura's are not unusual now. Like there's an appetite, to use an interesting word, for this kind of art. So I guess to me, the fact that you can engage with this kind of critical approaches through art that are thinking about our relationships with other animals, and that there's not just Cli-Fi, but there's just a bigger and bigger group of fictional products, and not just novels and short story collections, but also film that is really engaging with these things. I do think that's a sign of hope. But I'm in the hope gang, you know that, as a therapist. In terms of the future, I mean, I think that's moving in the right direction. I think often there are some movements in the right direction, but they're not as fast or as critical as we would hope. And I think that's kind of what, is being sort of said here as well by others. Certainly the speed of it with the, we know the climate crisis is very much upon us. It's not something in the future. The pandemic demonstrated that, and we definitely have missed an opportunity. So I don't think it's that there is no movement, but I think it's slower and less critical often than certainly we would like to see. Matthew?
Yeah, I agree with that. It reminded me of when me and Kate Stewart wrote our book together 10 years ago. And I think in the conclusion or the penultimate chapter, we did come up with a sort of wish list of, what would be the alternative, because the book is sort of documenting species' socialization practices across kind of every domain we could fit in the book, including formal education as well as popular culture, family practices, clothing, all sorts of things. And we did find some counterexamples, because of course vegans are doing stuff all the time, trying to kind of deconstruct speciesism and give a positive version of veganism, including 2 children. So there were examples that we wrote about in the book back then, and I think there have been many more since. And I think as vegans get access to positions of influence in creative industries, I think we see more and more of this, and we will see more and more of it. And in the recent, what's the name of the book? The Vegan Studies book, the big edited collection by Laura Wright. Is it Wright or White? Oh,
Right,
that's
I
embarrassing.
think.
Yeah, thank you. Anyway, in that book, so Kate and I wrote another chapter, which was maybe the only positive thing we've ever written, because we actually focused only on like good vegan stuff instead of slagging off annoying species stuff. So we wrote about a couple of films in there, which were giving a really positive representation of veganism, and at the same time critiquing speciesism and all the other intersecting oppressions. Well, not maybe not all of them, but getting into that side of things as well, which is really positive. So I think there will be more of that. And just thinking back to one example, one of the things we analysed in the book and in other writing is this whole phenomenon of farming simulation games that you can get on your mobile phone or tablet or something, just for sort of casual gaming. And they're sort of very cartoonified and stylized, but they're awful when you think about what's going on. They're all about commodifying non-human animals, profiting off them, and that's just presented as fun and cute and completely normal. But even back then, we were thinking we could totally flip this. You could have the same game mechanics based around a vegan scenario, where maybe you had a vegan sanctuary, perhaps, and the more animals you could rescue, the more public support you could generate, and there could be like a vegan cafe attached to the sanctuary, and you could profit from selling vegan products, and how many people would sign up to going vegan after visiting your sanctuary, in a gaming environment. So, and that's just sort of off the top of my head, but you can flip all of these speciesist popular cultural products very simply, and certainly you can do it in the formal curriculum. You can deconstruct all the kind of support for animal agriculture that's embedded in curricula, and start teaching about plant-based alternatives and all the various reasons for that. So, and going back to hope again briefly, that's one of the things that always has given me some hope in spite of everything, is the fact that the kind of speciesist opponent, if you want to put it that way, that we're struggling against is always built on sand. You know, the foundations are ridiculous, and they could collapse at any moment. You know, they're eminently collapsible. And so I've always kept hold of this hope that things could change very rapidly in maybe unpredictable ways. Maybe the climate crisis will be the trigger, who knows, at some point. I don't know. Or maybe it'll take another pandemic. But you'd like to think it could come through, you know, just everyone realizing, yeah, this is not working for anybody, humans or any other species. Let's change things rapidly. Who knows? But yeah, I've always had that hope, because it doesn't make any sense when you analyze speciesism. It's ridiculous. You know, the legitimations are spurious and self-evidently bogus. So that gives me some hope.
I'm glad we're talking ourselves around to being more positive. It's not very sociological of us, because sociologists are usually very grumpy, but it's nice. It's life affirming.
Laura's also mentioned in the chat about how the pandemic, to her mind, has enabled people to become more intimate with our outdoor environment and seeing it as worth protecting. And I think that's a really good point, because further to your work, Zoe, about, you know, being locked down and living with and noticing things in new ways, I think definitely we've missed an opportunity to link the pandemic to the ways we treat other animals. But I think in small ways that actually are having material impacts, you know, anecdotally, we do see people reconsidering, rethinking those sorts of relationships. Did you want to say anything more about that, Lara? Lara's in New Zealand as well, aren't you?
Yeah, no, just that we noticed a lot of people were sort of using. We live right by a really big park, and so we had one of the most restrictive lockdowns in the world. I think Melbourne, you had the longest, and Auckland and New Zealand had some of the most strict. So we couldn't even get a takeaway. We couldn't do online shopping. We couldn't do anything. We were all kind of very, very isolated in our homes, and we actually saw more of our neighbours and more of our local area, because, you know, we, on those forced breaks when you normally talk to a colleague or get up and wander around, we were going out for walks in the day and seeing people. And, you know, I'd spend an hour watching the kingfishers in the local bay. We were incredibly privileged in that time to be where we are, because we had access to this giant park. But now, 4 years later, somebody wants to build a helipad, and the whole neighbourhood is up in arms about it because of the dotterels and, you know, the wildlife that I don't think people would have noticed if we hadn't kind of had this forced kind of appreciation time. Yeah.
We do have a question in the chat from Anita as well. And Dinesh, Anita was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the shared messages amongst the trade unions on the rare times that they did have them.
Sure. Just a few things. I know we're at time. Something, I mean, to give you an example, in Australia, the origins of the live export campaign that has had minimal success. It has had some success in Australia. So this is the campaign, for those who don't outside of Australia, there's been a long-running campaign from animal advocates to end the live export of sheep and cows overseas. And Australia has one of the largest industries in the world, but also because of the distances, some of the cruelest live export practices. But some of the origins of the campaign were alliances between animal advocates and trade unions because of the shared concerns around human working conditions and the conditions for animals. So again, there are these examples out there. One thing I'd say is that there are, at this very moment, many live examples that, to me, are opportunities for animal advocates. So just to give you two examples, in Australia and in UK, veterinarians are getting organised and more militant. Part of that's been driven by the commodification of veterinary practice and the reduced conditions and pay for vets. And there have been cases such as in the UK and in Australia, it's actually happened this year, where vets go on strike and it closes down animal agriculture because they serve a role in inspection in the processing lines. Another example I just flag is that environmentalists and trade unions have been running a campaign in the Asia Pacific around the use of forced labour and low wage labour in fishing vessels in the Asia Pacific and also in seafood processing. In my view, this is another example of a campaign that it makes a lot of sense for animal advocates to pay attention to, just because of the sheer scale of the devastation on our seas that happens through that industrialised form of fishing, but also the reality that this industry is based on slave labour. So fighting for worker rights is one way to end the industry, if that makes sense. So I think there's something interesting about thinking about it in this sort of structural way. And I think there's a lot of scope for shared work without necessarily assuming that trade unions are interested in ending animal agriculture, because they're not. It's just using the structural position of those movements to make change.
Hey, thank you so much for that. I want to ask you so many more questions. I think we're just going to finish with a round robin if no one else has any other questions. Is that okay, Josephine, if I ask one more round?
I think, I think we should wrap up.
Very good. Can we finish with a final thought from each of our guests?
Absolutely.
Okay. So my last thing that I would like to know from you all, just very, very quickly, you've all got a different focus in your research. If we're thinking like next 5 years, what's one thing you would like sociologists to focus on to like better do multi-species sociology? Can I point at you, or do you want to go as the movement takes you? Nick, you look ready.
Yeah, sure. I guess one thing I'm interested in and sort of follows on from what I did is the plant-based universities campaign. I think that's quite an interesting campaign in the space and makes a lot of sense for us to focus on, given that we're at universities. So yeah, that's one thing I'm interested in.
Yeah, cool. Matthew, what would you like us to focus on?
Yeah, I mean, plant-based universities definitely. That's really exciting. What's happening there? Maybe another thing is research ethics, which is something I'm interested in. It would be amazing if sociologists started taking other animals seriously in terms of research ethics, in terms of approving projects and so on, rather than being entirely anthropocentric as they are in my experience so far. So that would be a real step forward, I think, for the discipline.
Yeah, cool. Dinesh, do you have one thing?
Futures, what do futures without mass animal exploitation look like? I think that's something I'd love to see.
Yeah, great. Josephine?
I'd love to see animal sociology taken seriously within broader sociology, like, replicating how it's taken seriously in other disciplines and fields. So, yeah, I think that's a really major thing to my mind. And also thinking about those decolonising epistemologies, opportunities, thoughts in multi-species sociology.
Thank you. That has satisfied my curiosity. I will leave you all alone now. Thank you for indulging me.
Thank you so much to everybody for coming. It's really wonderful to have had everybody here, and I want to give a special thanks to Chantel, who is the Secretary of the Australasian Animal Studies Association and also my wonderful colleague and co-writer. Thank you so much, Chantel, for all your help in helping to pull together the book launch. as well. And thank you again to ASA and to everybody who attended, people getting up early for us. Thank you so much. And happy World Vegan Day. I hope everybody has a fantastic evening or day, morning, whichever part of the day you're in your part of the world. Thank you so much for coming along. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. See ya.